Thank you very much. Excellencies, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. The focus of my presentation will be food safety. Actually, I will use the example of aflatoxins in Africa to highlight challenges of food safety and also possibly the potential of country-led coordination to deal with the problem. But let me start with this widely known FAO definition of food security, which expressly links nutrition and food safety as integral components of food security. So food security exists, as you know, this is a definition, I wouldn't go into that. But unfortunately, this linkage between food safety and nutrition and food security has not been materialized so far. There is a lot of focus on supply food production, which is justified, but unfortunately, it's giving disservice to nutrition and food safety and food security as well. So fortunately, the good thing is, over the last 10 to 15 years, we see some focus on nutrition, the importance of including nutrition into agriculture. I think there is a lot of recognition in that in the past decade or so. But still, what is less recognized is that unsafe, contaminated foods undermine food security and nutrition, especially in much of the developed world, the developing world. But food safety impacts on nutrition directly or indirectly. First of all, as you know, the food that's supposed to nourish people makes them ill, and millions of people get ill, fall ill every year. In Africa alone, according to a WHO estimate, 137,000 people die every year due to contaminated foods, due to foodborne diseases. And this is about 1/3 of the global death toll from foodborne illnesses. And at least 40% are children. So you can see also children under 5 are probably the most affected segments of the society. And also when contaminated food is withdrawn from the supply chain, for example, in Kenya in 2010, they withdrew 10% of maize, the maize produced from the market, because it was condemned due to aflatoxin contamination as unsafe for human consumption. So it can also directly affect the quantity of food that's available for consumption. But the other thing is food contamination also affects access to market, as most of you know. It's an important precondition to access global market and also increasingly better markets in the developing world. So it actually affects the continuum of market access, income generation, and even access to food eventually. But let me take you to aflatoxins. As I said, I will use this example to highlight some of the challenges we have in Africa, which is probably the case for some of the developing world. So aflatoxin is an invisible poison that contaminates a lot of crops, cash crops and staple crops in Africa. Actually, it contaminates at high levels roughly 40% of the commodities that are sold in our local markets. It is responsible for 30% of liver cancer cases in Africa. Actually, liver cancer is the #1 cause of cancer mortality in Africa because of this. And it also affects trade. This is a very conservative estimate. Our own estimate, just in groundnuts, shows billions of dollars could be lost due to lost export trade from aflatoxin contamination. So as to the scale of the problem in Africa, this is a study by PACA in 2015-16 in some of our focus countries. So you could see contamination levels up to 94% in groundnut in Senegal, 76% in Tanzania, and so on. Very high levels of contamination. And also the mean levels, on the y-axis, these are the mean levels of contamination, are quite high. So aflatoxin is very prevalent and at high levels. Also, biomarker data, biomarker analysis from human body fluids also confirms the high level of aflatoxin prevalence in African diets. If you see children from Benin, 99%, 98% with blood contamination by aflatoxin and so on. So this just confirms the high level of prevalence of aflatoxins in the continent. Most of the emphasis on aflatoxins is on liver cancer so far, but there is also mounting evidence that aflatoxin can be associated with stunted growth in children. So these are data from mostly from Africa, and a review from Asia and Africa show that aflatoxin exposure can be associated with childhood stunting. Of course, we still need conclusive evidence, and there are some studies that are going on which hopefully would provide some conclusive evidence on the cause-effect relationship between aflatoxin exposure and stunting. But one thing is clear, despite improvements in child and maternal nutrition throughout the world, the reduction in stunting is not that much. So I think probably it is time to look at such factors as exposure to aflatoxins and other anti-nutritional factors, to explain why we are not doing that well in terms of addressing childhood stunting globally, and especially in regions such as Africa. And recently, increasingly, we are seeing also outbreaks of acute poisoning by aflatoxin. People die, especially these are reports from Eastern Africa, Kenya, and recently also Tanzania in 2016. Also last year, we had outbreaks. This is probably because countries have started reporting. We probably had these outbreaks or these acute poisonings, for much of our history, but they are becoming more and more reported recently. However, this emphasis on the acute poisoning of aflatoxins is probably what we can call the iceberg metaphor. Still, the chronic effects of aflatoxins, like the liver cancer and possibly the stunting, are more important. So, African Union established an organization or a program called PACA, the Partnership for Aflatoxin Control in Africa, in 2012. And immediately after that, we did an early analysis, and this is what we saw. There are country-level challenges to deal with aflatoxin contamination and probably other food safety challenges in many of African countries. First of all, if you look at food safety and aflatoxin problems, they are complex. Especially aflatoxin, it occurs throughout the entire value chain from pre-harvest all the way up to storage and post-harvest. And so that makes it difficult to target interventions. So it's very difficult to apply a measure pre-harvest, post-harvest. Where do we target interventions? That can be a challenge. There is also general lack of access to evidence. Evidence is a big gap in our continent and probably in other low and middle income countries. And solutions exist. Solutions are available, but there is limited access to such solutions. And there is also limited implementation capacity, and awareness is generally lacking. And incentives, as the previous speaker also said, incentives, market distinction, or government policy incentives were lacking. And a big problem is food safety is scattered across different agencies with overlapping mandates. So these were problems that we identified. So we proposed a country-led approach for coordination for at least two strong reasons. One reason is if we are serious about addressing the aflatoxin problem and probably other food safety problems, we need coordination. We need systemic change, probably beyond small incremental responses, scattered, fragmented responses. We need systemic change. So for that, coordination is actually important. And the other thing is, if we want to bring on board an important stakeholder, which is government, these country-led approaches are probably the answer. So we saw also, you could see here that governments have wide sphere of influence. Whether we like it or not, they influence policy, even a research agenda, trade policies, capacity building, everything is under the influence of governments, especially in Africa. So actually a government-led and stakeholder-aligned, country-led approach appears to be an option. So we worked with the governments and tried to help them, first of all, generate locally relevant evidence and develop a national action plan. And secondly, to embed or include that national plan into their strategies to mainstream it so that it becomes sustainable, then providing support for implementation and for tracking progress. So we felt a single government-led country plan can actually fill in the gap between needed interventions and dedication of resources. Actually, as PACA, we are not implementing this. We are just providing support and helping them with tracking progress. So we worked with this model in 6 African countries, 3 in West Africa, Gambia, Nigeria, and Senegal, and another 3 in Eastern and Southern Africa, which are Tanzania, Uganda, and Malawi. So working with them so far in the past few years, first of all, we see a lot of prioritization of aflatoxin control in Africa, a lot of government buy-in, and also these national plans are included already in national strategies, mostly in what we in Africa call CAADP National Agriculture and Investment Plans. They are already part of that in all 6 countries, and we're seeing also investments to implement them. For example, in Tanzania, we saw we already have an investment of over $30 million US, which is probably the biggest for any aflatoxin project, aflatoxin control project worldwide. And in Senegal, the government itself has put in $1.2 million. Malawi just initiated a $1 million project with German funding. Gambia is funding national sensitization campaigns, and so on. So we are seeing investments because of these country-led approaches. And the other thing is, we're also seeing coordination, which is important when dealing with cross-cutting issues such as aflatoxin control and food safety. We have national steering committees, national technical working groups, and of course, African Union has also deployed a country officer. So coordination, we see a lot of coordination which is actually lacking and which is quite important. And progress tracking, another gap in the countries, is also proceeding better. Just to highlight a few more things, so because of this approach, actually, as I said, there is huge political buy-in. President Museveni opened the PACA Partnership Platform meeting 2 years ago. The coming one, next month, will be opened by President Macky Sall of Senegal and Excellency Chairperson of the African Union. This is huge, huge political buy-in. You don't get a serving president, to open your meeting unless they are committed to the cause. And also, the Joint Conference of Ministers of AU approved this model for use in all 55 member states last year in their conference. So we are seeing a lot of political buy-in, and I hope this will happen also to other food safety issues. And the other thing is, I'm approaching to my end. So the other thing is, using the PACA model is leading to broader continental efforts. For example, the AU just approved to develop an Africa Food Safety Index to track as part of what we call Malabo Biennial Review of Agricultural Transformation. This report will be presented every 2 years to the heads of states assembly, and which will be important for prioritization and tracking of food safety as a whole in the continent. The other thing is also building on the PACA model, the AU is trying to come up with the Food Safety Coordination Agency, which is currently a gap. We have a plant health agency, which is called Inter-Africa Phytosanitary Council. We have one on animal health, but food safety is a gap. So hopefully, this agency or center, whatever they call it, will be established soon and will help us in coordination of a holistic food systems approach to address food safety. So let me end with just a few messages. So looking at the economic and also, for example, the effect on children and so on, there is a moral, economic, and social imperative to ensure food safety for all, to maximize nutrition, food security, and development outcomes. And also, food safety is pre-competitive. So there is no competition in the area of food safety among business. So business can work together freely because they can't be outcompeted in the area of food safety. Actually, you know, a compromised food safety in any area will be bad for business as a whole. So I think partnerships can be, you know, genuinely established to enhance food safety in Africa and probably other low-income regions. And the other thing is, we have to start looking at embedding food safety in relevant nutrition and production projects, because it's pointless to work on, you know, nutrition or increased production if the food that is eventually produced is not safe for the consumers. So it's high time that we start embedding food safety in nutrition and value chain or food systems projects, the way we did, you know, for nutrition maybe a decade or 2 decades ago. So let me end with this. Thank you so much for your kind attention.
Thank you.